Fab, thank you. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll run through the introduction and overview, and if some more people come in, that's great. We can convene, and otherwise we're going to have a very focused conversation, which will also be good. All right, so this is the non-text research output, non-traditional research object, birds of a feather. We've got this session today, and we've got session 2, which I should have put a 22:30, mixing my 12 and 24 o'clocks there tomorrow night, just to be clear. So it's that. So we're going to start with the usual RDA stuff. We've got collaborative notes, and they are being posted in the chat. We have discussions which are being recorded for internal use. So that'll be for us to maybe take some notes and additions and do attributions for the collaborative note stock. And as it's an RDA session, we are, of course, under the RDA guiding principles. And if anything should happen that is felt to be untoward, the RDA approach and processes on how to report a breach are there in the collaborative doc. Okay. So brief introductions. Hello, I am Adam Vilesmer, the product specialist for persistent identifiers at JISC. I'm responsible for PIDs and the wider kind of metadata policy and kind of infrastructure environment around research outputs and objects. Jenny, do you want to quickly say hello?
Yes, hello, I'm Jenny. I'm Research Environment and Scholarly Communications Lead, University of Westminster, and I led a practice research arts and humanities non-traditional outputs based project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is our agenda, which we will see how we get on with. So we've got 10 minutes of me talking, saying hello, going through this. We've got 20 minutes from Jenny on kind of why we're here and the kind of background to things that we've already done. Then we are hoping to have experiences and learning from other people. So part of the reason for putting this together as a birds of a feather was to learn from others that are here. Then thinking about, in particular, focusing on like creating and supporting these non-text, non-traditional research outputs and objects, and then thinking about the co-design. So one of the things that we'll talk about next is about this idea of ensuring that rather than developing a thing for and then going, here is the thing, it's great, and people going, no, I really don't want that thing, we do it all together. Then we'll have a look at kind of open standards, where those things are happening, what more we can do to work those out, think about ways forward, and then think about specifically ways forward within the RDA. And at the end, we'll stop. Okay. So a brief overview. These are basically the notes from the submission to bring this birds of a feather together. So what we want to do is think about the kind of learning from all the communities that create these processes and products. We want to think about how we share the outcomes and experiences, and then think all together about kind of standards, implications, and how to identify the relevant working communities. Right, 2 quick slides. So there are many research communities that create non-traditional, non-text process and products. They're typically referred to as NTRO, and one of the things that we've been thinking about, and is exactly which kind of does that umbrella where things are like both non-traditional and non-text, does that sit well? Do we need to leave it slightly ambiguous like that, or is it a slightly better way of discussing these things? Jenny and myself run PR Voices, so that's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. We worked with the practice research community to have recommendations for these NTROs to receive parity amongst the research products. So the whole point behind PR Voices was to look at how we move forwards with these things, which are quite often other, last bullet point, and move that into an actual full, rich and detailed description. So the idea is that this session will bring together these various communities. So see how that goes. And they therefore want to think about what are the implications for process and product, what's supporting infrastructure, how do we become that kind of interactive scribe on the side, so we're not focused on this whole kind of idea of like the PDF, the terminal output, the report, but more about capturing the whole broad spectrum of research, process, practice, and outputs. And then what's that mean for RDA? How do we influence conversations, especially where people are saying things like open science, and maybe that doesn't, respect the full breadth of research in the academe. So, we sometimes internally talk more about fair research rather than open science. Both that idea of fair as open as possible, as closed as necessary, and research rather than science, which is in some ways a kind of an English language thing, where there's not quite the same kind of discriminators in other languages, but in quite a lot of Romantic STEM languages, there's a similar kind of divide between talking about kind of technology oriented and creative practice. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Jenny, who will talk us through where we're coming from and what we did in PR.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Just share my screen. Check that this is working. Okay, so can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, so what I'm actually going to start with is some definitions. So Adam said a bit about that. I think this is useful, particularly this idea of practice research, which is, I think, quite UK and potentially Europe specific. It's not necessarily talked about in the same way in the rest of the world. Definitions of non-traditional, non-text, so research outputs which do not take the form of published books, book chapters, journal articles, or conference publications. Going back to Adam's points around this idea of non-traditional, non-text, it's all about this kind of add-on, these outputs as an add-on to this environment, and to embed these outputs in open standards, we need to move away from them being an add-on and towards them being part of the landscape. In the UK, they're called multi-component outputs because they're often more than one connected together. Excuse me, spring has sprung here, or perhaps even summer. The idea of output or object, Adam's mentioned. Being specific about this idea of practice research, looking at research where practice is a significant method of research conveyed. So it looks different in different disciplines. It's not just around taking place in that kind of those creative practice, arts and humanities disciplines, but those are the disciplines that kind of lose out the most by not having their research recognised. What's also really important is this idea of research narrative. So a narrative describing the research element of an output. I guess the other thing just to remind us all is that these practice research outputs can be text-based. So we need to not forget about text when we're talking about these outputs. I think a lot of conversations tend to be about text or non-text or non-traditional, and we need to talk about them as a whole. So features of non-traditional, non-text research outputs or objects, they're often non-text, they often change over time. They can include multiple files of different formats, which can either be closed or open. That goes back to that idea of fair research rather than open science. Representation of performance rather than live event. So remediation of a work is necessary to record it and to document it. Research element can be embodied in the work itself or needs to be evidenced by that narrative, which I've just talked about. Process is as significant as that end product. Can be linear or non-linear, and the processes can be linear or non-linear. Time-based and often involve a range of contributors that deserve acknowledgement and recognition. So that's something else. It's not just about outputs here, but it's also about the contributors creating importing into a output. So practice research voices aim to scope on a national practice research repository built on the work we developed at Westminster that created a repository that embedded practice research from the beginning. So moving, reiterating that point Adam said, to this repository discoverability and interoperability landscape where practice research disciplines are embedded rather than afterthoughts, and really bringing together voices from the many interested communities. I think that's where we're hoping RDA can ultimately help here, as being one space where multiple communities come together. The team was quite varied. I led this work. It was a real piece of collaboration between research information management, repository research data, PID, metadata experts, and academic disciplines, software developers across a number of institutions in the UK. And a huge thank you, as always, to AHRC for funding this work. I've mentioned our development of the Haplo CAIS repository, so we've got a reference there to that work. So we really did use this idea of co-design, and we worked directly with our academic community to do this work rather than imposing what we thought they wanted on them. And they actually wanted us to refer to these outputs as non-text, which is why we tend to use that as a term. Working with JISC and Adam specifically, and then the British Library to raise awareness that these outputs weren't reflected in open standards. These PragUK reports really published. There are different flavors of practice research. There's practice-based research, practice-led research, and so actually building a solid definition of practice research has allowed us to move on from that debate, which has been ongoing for years. So we looked at that technical and academic challenges. This is not just about technology, it's about engaging in discipline with our discipline communities. To effectively share and disseminate and use and reuse existing technology and standards where possible, rather than creating new ones. This part of this came from a conversation where some of our arts and humanities researchers in the UK were asking for a web of arts, so like the arts version to the web of science, and that's, for me, we have an opportunity here to actually work with open standards and open technologies where possible, so we can build something sustainable that isn't owned by owned in its entirety by commercial suppliers. So this intersectional practice research community of practice is really important, just because it talks about kind of the discipline communities. It talks about things like entities such as the Australian Research Data Commons, but also Crossref, DataSide, ORCID, RAID, Credit. All of these communities having individual conversations. The taxonomy communities, Credit probably should be over there, to be honest, that kind of is. Librarians, records managers in the UK anyway, impact managers, our research excellence framework is actually one kind of mechanism that does recognise and reward practice research outputs. Records managers, there are just so many people and groups with a vested interest in this. It isn't just about repositories, it's also about preservation of content. This content is lost at present quite often because it's not captured and preserved effectively. So our findings with a little Sparkle, our sister project, as we'll call them, our sibling project, the Sparkle project, which stands for Sustaining Practice Assets in Research, Knowledge, Learning and Education, which was led by the University of Leeds, took a more interviews academic-led approach to their funded project, which was funded under the same call. So our findings include their findings. So working with community and communities, I guess we alone at RDA are talking to a bunch of different specialist communities. There are loads of different discipline communities here and funder communities and many communities. This idea of a platform being interactive, so moving repositories from being that retrospective archive where research goes to die in some cases, and actually making it interactive, capturing it, preserving it, and enabling that discoverability, citation, preservation. So I think that's the other thing to say, is that we need standards here so that this works and that these groups benefit from interoperability and discoverability, recognising contributors, making sure open standards underpin this work. But there are a range of challenges here: sustainability, expertise, preservation. Recommendations to continue that co-design with community, embedding practice research in open standards, making this more than retrospective archives in the case of the repository, training is needed across all of these communities, from repository experts all the way through to musicians, practice researchers, creative arts, dance, academics, and investment in capacity, people and infrastructure. So that's all the background. So the important piece here is this idea of portfolio. So when we built and developed the repository at Westminster, we initially thought that a portfolio is equivalent to the idea of collection. So what this work enabled us to do was think about this and ask the question, is a portfolio equal to collection? So what we've actually identified is that we need to capture individual objects on an ongoing basis, bring these together in a collection, and that a portfolio or theme builds on the idea of collection and overlays that narrative and context. And narrative and context is very, very important for these disciplines. You can't just deal with these individual files or outputs. You can capture them individually, but you need the context to articulate that research question and narrative. So design and what it matters, what it looks like, matters, beauty. So our repositories landscape isn't really built for people who care what their research looks like. So that is really important, capturing all contributors and acknowledging them, making this content accessible, navigable. So navigation in the portfolio is something that came through as really important. So not just a bunch of files collected together, but there being contextual navigation between them, capturing and displaying process, which is not just text-based, more interactive, preserving files and potentially website content, software integrations, and some additional output types. So what we came up with, we're doing some further work at the moment around better articulating this schema. So bear with us, this is a kind of first pass, is this idea of portfolio, the artifact output type, and then exhibition, which is slowly and surely becoming an event output type, and that kind of dates piece being really important here. So what does it look like in our schema? We've got, as we've just said, really there, this is a bit more Westminster specific, the non-text output, text outputs, exhibition or event, collection, portfolio, contributor, creator and collaborator. So that's the other thing, this idea of collaborators having different levels of involvement in an output. So is this portfolio the same as collection? I think I've just realized that's a bit of a duplication of slide. Apologies there, different picture. And the idea of the RAID identifier is really timely for this work. And I think Adam can talk way more about RAID than I can, but really just to reiterate that this idea of a project item type that the RAID enables, where you can collect together different objects in an envelope, is really important. So it allows the reflection of that narrative, chronological view of activity. Data site, we were very lucky to have Jez Cope from the British Library in the UK involved in a workshop. There's a link at the bottom of this slide. I'll tidy that up so you can see that a bit more easily later. Data site is working to a certain extent, and I think actually this has also possibly been superseded since the end of the project. But Jez very rightly kind of asked the question, is RAID more appropriate? Because of this idea of collection being about a bunch of objects being collected together rather than having that context. Narrative, creator and contributor. I think what's really important to remember with these is that all of these standards connect up, but if it's not working in one, it's probably not working in any of them. So you'll notice we haven't really particularly mentioned ORCID today, and that's partly just because we had to focus on a few key standards at the time we had. And the credit taxonomy, huge opportunity here, but needs loads of work to recognize these different types of contributor in a way that's standard. Really just almost finishing, referencing the work that our wonderful colleagues at the More Brains Cooperative have done around persistent identifier workflows. And this is really just identifying how this, in terms of institutional research management, how it should work. We've mapped on in the kind of pink at the bottom there where practice research outputs might sit within that research management workflow, and then kind of highlighting some findings that are relevant. So, for example, not all practice research is funded research, so it doesn't have a funder mandate. when you put stuff into a national reporting system in the UK, it's very hard to upload practice research and event output types. Adam's mentioned the idea of fair versus not equal to open, not capturing the right or appropriate metadata in the events output type. We know there is an events output type out there, but actually what it's capturing isn't necessarily useful. And again, for example, an institution might not be the publisher, it might be a gallery but there may be a DOI requirement. So that kind of idea of ownership of content here is worth mentioning as well. Or for example, if you're collaborating outside academia, they don't have an ORCID. So I won't go into any more detail than that, but just really to indicate we've done some thinking around this. So really just finishing, I think, again, we've done this twice, apologies, might need to tidy up these slides before the second session. Co-design with community, embedding practice research and open standards, being more than retrospective archive, need for training and investment in capacity, people and infrastructure. And Stephen Hill's the Director of Research in Research England. He really sees the benefits of this practice research lens being used. It can benefit all disciplines if we embed their approach into the standards. And it's about understanding what's reasonable. So it's not about changing all of everything. It's about finding kind of where the boundaries are and what we can do usefully to make our standards work for all, without, I guess, going over the top in terms of customization. And making it all special and different again. And this, I guess, benefits here, an inclusive ecosystem, valuing all research and contributors. And that's a very quick skate through of our work. So I am happy to see we've got a few people in the room. So welcome to those of you who've made it. I'm Jenny, co-running this session. So there is a link to the slides. I'm just going to stop sharing now. And I guess really we've given you our thoughts about how this works. But actually what we really want to hear is other people's thoughts and opinions. And I've just noticed that there's some comments in the chat, which is really helpful. And so I think I've lost track. Adam may be able to put me back on track next 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes is really around trying to ask you as attendees to share your thoughts and experiences, ask questions, comments. We are more than happy and open to disagreements and other ideas. That's part of the reason we're here, is to get some new perspectives on this work and thoughts. So is it worth us doing a quick?
I think, sorry, thanks for that, Jenny. That was awesome. Hello, Alison, Holly, and Lise are co-conspirators on the Gaggle. So let's see. So I put the slide up. So the next 15 minutes or so are around about why you're here. So sorry, this is kind of not all us talking. I mean, we could, we're happy to do that, but I don't think it's a necessarily great idea. So what we'd really like to hear is kind of like around kind of where your experiences are with either creating or supporting. And then the thing that Jenny really pulled out again from the kind of Pure Voices work is that we really need to do this work hand in hand with the creators of these outputs, these objects. So it's also kind of like learning around kind of the community interactions, those kind of co-design pieces, and what they're doing. I mean, I think because we've got hardly that huge number of people here, maybe we can just do a 2-second intro. So hello from Jenny and I. If I just go down the list, I can see Alison, if just say hello and where you're from, one-liner.
Oh, one-liner, that's absolutely
well, all right then.
No,
bearing in mind the time we have available.
We can start with the one-liner. I'm sure we can get into more details later. I can manage that. You see, I've already done my one-line and I haven't even told you who I am. I am Alison Lister. I work at University of Oxford, and I work on the Fair Sharing Project, where I am the content and community lead. I've also been an RDA domain ambassador. Those ambassadorships are all finished, but the work is ongoing to translate that into an interest group about engagement and cross-disciplinary and cross-regional outreach. So there's a repeat of that session tomorrow night. Look at me plugging. But I'm actually really interested in the whole, the idea of digitized collections. And I'm trying to get my head around it a little bit, both within the context of fair sharing, where we don't have a particular way of representing them. And we're thinking maybe we need something more explicit. We do already describe databases, knowledge bases, repositories, but these are different beasts. And having never heard of your acronym, Adam, and being very curious about what an NTRO NITRO is, and having only discussed with a few people around Oxford and within the RDA about digitized collections, I'm just trying to get a little bit of a better handle on how these interesting types of digital objects work.
Fabulous. Thank you. Hello, welcome. We'll
Thank you.
talk more in just a minute. Lise, you're next on my screen.
Yes, hi. I hope you can hear me. For some reason,
perfectly.
the session opened in Wova, not in Zoom, and I'm very lost as to. So anyhow, I cannot figure out how to switch my video on, so I apologize for that.
No worries.
So my name is Lisa Lehtelu, and I've recently joined RDA Europe, where I am working first and foremost on facilitating working groups. But before that, so up until April, so a couple of weeks ago, I was a data steward for all intents and purposes in a research performing organization where I, over the last few years in particular, came in contact increasingly with outputs from participative action research. And they were outputs from Horizon Europe funded projects. So we ran into the question of the Commission's data management requirements as applied on participative action research and what it means. And this is where my interest in this topic comes from. So I saw the session and was like, I want to hear what you guys have to say around this, because there was a practical issue we had in trying to manage mostly co-design products, so things from co-design workshops, where participants in the workshops together with the researchers produced anything from, post-it mind maps to actual physical objects, but also more the process itself of participative action research. So because there the output is so intertwined with the methodology, so that the methodology itself almost becomes an output. And how you manage that in line with FAIR principles, and B, how do you deposit that? Or I guess that's already managing in line with FAIR principles.
Yeah.
But how do you deposit that? So those were the questions that with the researchers we tried to understand, and I have to admit we didn't really have the time or the resources to find good answers. So we did probably a horrible job in terms of trying to capture some, digitize some, and put things into repositories, put write-ups of methodology in repositories. But I'm sure there are better ways of doing it. In fact, I see that, you just presented a case of better way of doing it. So thank you for that.
Cool, thank you. And I'd really like to hear more about what you've been doing. So I think we've got some really good points to move through. Holly. Hello. Okay, you've come off mute, but we can't hear you. Have I disappeared, or is Holly not coming through?
Oh.
Oh.
You there?
There you go.
We heard a word.
Oh, it's all gone well. Sorry, Holly.
Do we think that's
yeah,
the platform? Similar issues to Lise?
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess, Holly,
Okay,
if you've got chats, you could always, if the chat's working for you, you could throw in an intro by chat and we can read it out. Oh, she is here. She's going to leave and come back. Okay, so let's give that a go.
It's a bit odd, isn't it? Because when I did a session this morning, it seemed like everyone was out of the platform, just in the normal Zoom application. But when I joined this one, I was surprised to find it was all integrated in a frame within the Hoover. I don't know about how it is for you.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's the same for me. It's all integrated, and I have the chat open, and it's covering everything, and I cannot see anything but the chat now, and I cannot close the chat because it's so anyhow.
Oh gosh. Yeah, Hoover is intriguing. Holly, you're back. How's it going?
Yes, we can see you. This is good.
Hey.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I've got stuck in Hoover, but now I've managed to open it in Zoom. So hello, everybody. For interest of transparency, I was also involved in the PR Voices project. I was most recently the Research Data Management Officer at the University of Westminster, and I am about to be Head of Open Research at the University of Sheffield. I am interested in this just because it's a super interesting project, so I want to see where it goes next. Also, it will be relevant to my work, my interests. So at Sheffield, for example, they do have strength in practice research, although in the health and social care and education settings. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that research, if they're even capturing it in their repository. And secondarily, to pick up on something that Lise was saying as well, the work that the PR Voices project is doing with practice research and capturing all those really complex contributorship roles is really important for some of the nascent conversations in the open, fair research data space about recognizing autonomy of participants as data owners and data subjects, data rights holders, particularly when we think about co-creation activities, participatory research, public engagement, health research, that sort of thing. So that's where I'm coming from. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yeah, okay, sorry. Right, so it's too many windows open, so sometimes I think I'm muted and I'm not, sometimes I'm not muted when. Anyway, so great, thanks everyone. So there's two things that I'd like to do first. First of all is just check everyone is in the collaborative notes and can see them. So either say yes or give us a thumbs up, whatever. Thanks, Lise.
Yep, I'm in.
Fabulous. Grand. Okay. And then the next thing is, of course, to make sure you add your presence to the first, not the second, the first session there. So as we know who's been, who is seemingly more or less telling us. And then the third thing is, thanks, leading on from those intros, which were fab. Thank you so much. I guess there's a couple of things that we want to look at. First is kind of like those experiences with communities that we start to introduce so compellingly. And secondly, then we want to think about kind of how we work with those platforms, standards and so on that we have, and how we kind of move towards what we've definitely thought of as an aim for quite some time, but was very expressed as part of PR Voices, which is about this kind of parity, right? So that we're not all like talking about the other, yes, those other things. So what I'd really like is if first of all, I'd be a bit kind of directed and cherry, but I'll get more into discussion in a minute.
Go for it.
Would you be able would you be able to say a little bit more, Lise, first about kind of how both the co-design and that capture work kind of filled out a bit? So would be great to hear just a few more details. And then Alison, it would be really good to hear from you a bit more about kind of your thoughts on collections. We really worked on some of this as well. I think then after that we could do some discussing. And Holly, if you want to pitch in with some of your thoughts there too. Well, and then we'll move on to kind of like standardy bits after that. So Lee.
For the participative action work, what the researchers decided to do, is going back a bit to what Holly was saying right before, was to really work with the participants to have to make sure that the participants were briefed on this work being shared, potentially, what they were doing together with the researchers, and that they were okay with that, and B, also received actually authorship on some of the materials. And there, from data management perspective, it was actually quite an ethics and legal compliance conundrum to resolve as well, because we all know that there's the thing called GDPR, but the national applications of GDPR are very different from EU member state to EU member state. And in Italy, it's very restrictive application of GDPR. So the researchers actually really struggled to convince our privacy officers that, naming participants is something that should be done. And I think for most participatory action, and actually also citizen science research, this is a major hurdle that researchers see when they try to start sharing those outputs, making those outputs available via repositories, for example, is that disclosing the identity of the participants or the co-designers, co-creators is legally difficult, and they really have to think about it very early on in the project. So that was a major issue in the process. I don't know if your question went in that direction, but I just wanted to highlight that as something that we struggled with. And then
that's brilliant. Thank you.
And then the second issue that we struggled with was exactly to identify what it was that the researchers shared, so that the sharing would have a point, so that it wouldn't be sharing for compliance sake, so that you can put a DOI in a report to the funder, but it would be sharing with the potential of meaningful reuse. And what they should share from their participative action project. And I think that was something that in that particular project, they never did manage to think through properly, because time ran out of that on them, basically. And the project ran out, they had to prepare the final report, and they quite honestly just ended up sharing some a methodology write-up and some photos of the participative action events and so on. But it was because they couldn't really quite identify what the object to be shared was. That would then encourage any meaningful reuse of the material. I don't know if that makes sense.
that makes total sense and really chimes with some of the things that we've been both seeing and doing as well. I don't want to come in lots before other people have had a chance to speak, but thank you so much. That really kind of both covers issues that it helps to highlight, and we definitely have some common issues and thoughts and challenges.
Yeah, and I'm writing. I'm
sorry.
documenting this, by the way, just to reassure you. So people keep talking, and I'll keep writing.
Thank you. Alison, you're on mute.
I am on mute. Here I am again.
There you are again. So yeah.
Would you just like me to expand a little bit on what I said in my introduction?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, I mean, specifically on kind of like this first bit's kind of like experience, and then the second bit we'll come and talk about. Sorry.
I'm going to talk to you in the morning.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye. Sorry for that. We're getting our bathroom redone, and the lovely gentleman here who's doing the work just was telling me he was going. So.
Oh, lovely. Well, why did
you got to experience that too. He's actually really nice. So, but anyway, let me get move back to where you said two things. The second thing I missed because.
Okay. So, exactly. Expanding in this bit, we're going to think more about kind of like experience and where we've been and what we've kind of like figured out along the way. And then the next section, we're going to think about what are kind of the implications for that, especially with regards to standards and things like that. So that well, I was just trying to shape a little bit where we were hoping to go in this bit.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. Thank you.
Cool.
I added a little link to the notes just where you were adding the notes, and that is sort of the background. I'm not gonna read it out to you or anything. Don't worry. But that's sort of the background for why I am investigating this kind of work. So. Originally, back in its earliest days, fair sharing was a life science only resource. And now I'm talking well more than 10 years ago. And that is this URL here. And when it came into being, it was a registry of standards, databases, and policies that were used in that area. And very quickly, we realized we couldn't just talk about the life sciences. If we wanted to cover good research data management, we had to broaden to all areas. And so for many years, we have been a registry of those standards, databases, and policies that are relevant to the entire research data community across all research areas, with the idea being that we can help people find the resources they need to enable FAIR. Okay, so it's not just that we register the resources and help them for discovery and citability and things like this, but we also create a network graph, a sort of knowledge graph of how each of these resources relate to each other, what standards are implemented by which databases, what policies are required for use for particular, what policies recommend which standards and databases, maybe which standards extend other standards, that kind of thing, to try to create a sort of network of the landscape of good RDM resources. And over the last year, I was talking with some people in Oxford. I was approached by someone at the Ashmolean, and there was also joined in our community champion program by someone from Bodleian. And they were talking about how can we represent these lovely collections that have their own kind of unique identity, because they'd really like to have a central registry, not just for Oxford, but looking more broadly across all social sciences and GLAM stuff, to try to find out what's out there, because a lot of people's knowledge and use of collections in these fields, apparently, from what I'm learning, is word of mouth. You know what collection you need, you go to it, and whether it's a bonus if it's a digitized version of it. And so they're not really databases or repositories. Collections are often within a larger repository, like an institutional archive, but they're not always. And sometimes they're within more than one repository. And when do you want to name a collection as its own entity? And when is it really completely subsumed within a repository? So I'm trying to get to the bottom of how people think of collections in social sciences, because it's very different from how we think of traditional data collections in the life sciences, and teasing out whether or not we need to model that differently in fair sharing. And so I've been talking with Beth from the Collections as Data interest group at the RDA, which is not quite a real interest group. It's been renamed from, there was an older interest group that calls me like Digitized Collections or something like this. And they're renaming it and rewriting the charter to be Collections as Data interest group. And so that might be, you guys might already be members of that. Thank you, Lisa. That's really makes sense to me too. So I'm working with Beth from Digital Repository of Ireland, and with, again, the people I know at Oxford from Ashmolean and Bodleian, and I'm just trying to figure it out. And that page I linked is, anyone can edit it. So if it's at all of interest to you guys, or your thoughts around maybe coalescing into a working group, or indeed want to talk with Beth from Collections as Data, then I'm happy to do that as well. So I'll put her surname in, because I never know if she's Nizuk or Kazuk. So I need to ask her how to pronounce her surname. But there you are. So here I am coming to this because I want to know about these things I've never heard of, and these nitros, and are they the same as just what I think of in the chat window when I asked you what remediations were, and thinking about the picture of the pot from Crete with the octopus on the side and how that relates to the actual pot from Crete with the octopus on the side, and things like that. Yep.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Alison. I'm part of the Collections as Collections.
Oh, that's perfect, Adam. Group. I don't know who it is because I haven't had the chance to go to many meetings yet.
But similarly, I capacity-wise, I'm not getting along to as many of those meetings as I would hope so. But yeah, no, they're absolutely a very important kind of adjacent piece of work to this for definitely very similar reasons. And one of the things at the last meeting I was at, was discussions around kind of collections against portfolios, against capture of narrative, against the kind of things that you were talking about as like these kind of remediations. So part of the like kind of discussions, which we will go on to in a few minutes, is around kind of like how we reflect all those various items and outputs, and how we work alongside what exists to bring parity, rather than just creating a whole new set of thing, like Jenny said, rather than creating the web of arts and just creating a completely different thing, which will eventually end up being owned by somebody and won't actually, progress anything. How we push into the standards that are already there, how we make sure that, like, kind of fair is respected. And I'll stop now, but next bit. But yes, thank you. Perfect. Holly, an opportunity for you to like talk about where we've come from. And
no, I'm mostly happily just listening in. Maybe something to have in the background. I found out today, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, there's a COARA working group around practice research as well. So that might be interesting to chat to those people. I think I guess because they're also they're going to be coming at it from a co-design work as well. So although it will be talking about measurements, I guess you need to disseminate and share this research in the first place, right? So they could be good to talk to.
That's fabulous, thank you. And I think, yeah, I haven't found that yet, so that would be great. I think part of the piece of why this is now, very timely work, although you've been timely for a very long time, is around the kind of now responsible metrics of the kind of like better assessment of research, and kind of valuing more all the people in that kind of research chain. So not just, a PI and their PDFs, but all of the people all around. And Lee's, one of the things that struck me about you discussing how to both give credit and, give value and preserve the information of who is involved in something against those kind of issues around GDPR and privacy, and the kind of public information space, I think are partly really well covered by FAIR and partly covered by the use of abstracted identifiers. I am in charge of the UK consortium for ORCID, so I will give that, as a fair disclosure. But ORCID works as a way of having a representation of an individual, whereas at the same time respecting kind of GDPR and control of the individual, of their information and their privacy, and so on. So ORCID allows people to say, I am this identifier, and then control how much of the additional information is actually exposed in a public manner. And some of those things, although obviously not necessarily ORCID itself, but an almost identical framework, or the same framework, there's lots of things to talk about that in the next thing, are very applicable to these kind of questions around kind of contributorship, right? Because it's a really important area, especially as we move towards kind of valuing the whole of the research, the whole of the value and the contribution towards the outputs. So does anyone want to speak again about kind of any of the things that we've raised in this kind of section? So about kind of either like participatory things, about how the kind of like tensions around capture and what exactly we're capturing, or do we think that it might be useful to go and talk about where the kind of landscape of this is now and how we kind of interact with that and how we move that stuff forwards?
I think, Adam, I was just going to add one brief point. I've put a sentence in the notes just to remind us. So the British Library was a partner on PR Voices, and we did some schema validation work. But what's interesting about the British Library is they have repository and they have collections. And so we found in terms of that schema validation that there were things that they couldn't do in their repository because the collections part of the library own that work. And so there's a kind of cultural policy consideration here about who controls what goes where. So I thought that was probably just worth referencing. And I think cats are mandatory. Dogs are not allowed. Sorry, Adam. Cats are mandatory. I love the tail. My cat is sitting quietly sleeping on the chair in the sun next to me. Sadly, she's not one for video calls. So hello, kitty cat.
Hello, research cat.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that. I am a cat person, I have to say.
As is Holly,
I will start flooding the chat with pictures of my dog now, but that's fine.
You're overruled.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Yeah, so anyway. that was I just thought I'd reference that as an interesting thought or relevant comment.
Thanks for that. I've realized I'm sharing screen, so no one can really see anyone else. So I apologize. I'll stop that in a minute. But I thought it would be useful just to like kind of keep the focus on where we want to talk about things. So I'm gonna not rant, absolutely, and Jenny will stop me in a couple of minutes anyway, because I think again this really is kind of like opposite to things, Lisa, you're talking about with how to capture, how to represent this kind of process, and the vast breadth of things that happen. And also, Alison, this comes back to like questions around collection, around kind of the items that are in it, and so on. So one of the kind of long-standing things for me as a performative poet who did things with AR is that there was no way for me to ever describe that and put it in a repository, and I could stick the code from JavaScript, but that wasn't actually what I was doing, for example. And the kind of landscape that we have at the moment for a lot of description of artifacts is around kind of the STEM influencing things about kind of a PDF, or if you talk about an event, you're talking about a very specific thing that's like that's something that was put around a particular kind of item, and it's a workshop or a conference session or something like that, and it's not quite the same as an event which is necessarily kind of a performance. It's not kind of got some of the same kind of affordances and characteristics. Now, the thing that has become clear through a lot of the work that we've been doing, and again, this is something we really like to discuss and make sure that we're all kind of both seeing the same kind of tensions and thinking about similar approaches, and really need to learn and share on this, is that creating a new set of stuff just leaves us on the side, right? It's like, here is the new thing for a particular part of like creative practice, and here is the particular things for that. But then, so for example, if you do that inside a repository, then when you come to create a way for discussing that in the wider global academe, what you end up with a DOI, which has lots of categories which are other. And, it doesn't really kind of work. And so what we need to be doing is moving into the kind of schema and vocabulary spaces of this so that we are creating those types, those artifacts, those registers of things that then exist in parity with the other types of work and output. The other kind of thing to discuss on that is like, as Jenny was just saying about this idea of collections. Now, so poet, but also computer science and mathematician. So we have like this idea between like the disordered and ordered sets, right? There's things chucked in a bucket, which is a collection of things, right? But there is also, a narrative, a set of process, and a thing that shapes both kind of output and the kind of practice itself. And capturing those is incredibly important. And so some of the things we've talked about is like this kind of idea of a scribe at the side. So being able to lodge and register stuff as it happens, as it occurs, and not as some kind of terminal event. I realized I probably need another word other than terminal. In my first year, I was told I had a terminal exam, and I thought, like, God, it's a live or die kind of thing. Anyway, ADHD and talking for too long is not good. Right, so part of the focus on here and on this particular set of discussion is around where we've kind of discovered things that work, where we're into areas where we think there can be some development, and where we think there kind of needs to be pushback against some of the like kind of schemas and taxonomies are happening. And that final bullet point is very much speaking to kind of like fair against open, right? We hear open science, we hear about open access, we hear about, and that's great if you want OpenAI to build ChatGPT on your stuff, but it's not so good if you want to actually respect the kind of IP and creative ownership of things. So at this point, I think taking a deep breath, and so it'd be great to hear from the rest of you on these particular matters.
I don't have any deep thoughts, but one thing I would say is that with any humanities researcher, FAIR goes over much better than open science or open research. They're much more, in my experience, receptive to FAIR and understand FAIR in terms of as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Then they like the sound of open, open, open. Very random comment, but just a comment.
Yeah, I think fair and open, people often conflate them. And that's one of the things that I sort of battle against when I'm talking to people who aren't like us and involved in RDM and the RDA in general a lot more often. Is fair is a spectrum. Fair does not have to mean open, as you say, and trying to get people to understand that fair is more, in some ways, more inclusive, especially for sensitive data or data you're not sure how to put or where to put out, or, you were talking about GDPR issues earlier and things. It's just a comment in reply, that's all.
And thank you, but I think that's certainly been, so we try as much as possible to shape conversations around fair research rather than open science. Although, as even up to the UN, we have open science policy and practice. And I think it's that tension between inclusivity and some actual kind of perception about what is research and what is the point of research, and how research should be perceived and consumed. And I think part of that is actually one of the difficulties between open science and fair research. There are, as I mentioned, some tensions which are English language tensions as well. And that I think is also something that's worth recognizing. in a, hopefully global and accessible, inclusive academe, there's this idea about, how we actually talk about research and science and those endeavors. I'd be really interested, Lisa, if you had from the kind of capturing work that you did, if you could outline a bit about any ways that you found to get the things that you were capturing into repositories that kind of were on the edge of what was possible, or whether you just had to kind of squash stuff in to what was there already.
I have to say that in those particular cases, the researchers ended up using Zenodo, where they worked with keywords that they freely chose. And I think what they did in terms of the output type, they submitted it as a report, basically. So it was not submitted as data, or I think it's a report type in Zenodo, right?
Yep.
Which was questionable in a sense that, I mean, it was a report. It was a report on the methodology and the action that they did. But in that sense, yes, it was squashed, but it was all part of this rushed, confused conversation that happened too fast, in too short of a time frame about what outputs there are. And then when they finally decided on it, they're just doing a quick write-up, then actually, putting it into the repository as a report, it wasn't difficult. But it was because we potentially, in the project had already decided upon a not perhaps the most appropriate output type. But the output type that we chose, it was easy to put it into Zenodo, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And thanks, that's really helpful insight. So one of the things that I've seen is this kind of tension between controlled vocabularies, which help us to kind of discover and describe things, and kind of the folksonomies that develop around people creating, words and labels and things, because there isn't really anything else there. So you end up tagging your outputs with words that you believe are appropriate, but won't necessarily make their way into a particularly controlled vocabulary. And I think some of the work around kind of making this thing more recognized is about kind of taking some of those kind of folksonomic tagging and working out how they match through to some of the vocabulary.
Yeah, exactly. This is exactly what I meant with, they just chose, free form keywords, basically. But at the end of the day, I mean, these particular outputs, they ended up being outputs to fulfill a funder compliance, a funder mandate. They were compliance outputs. And I think, the mad rush to decide on output type, then, the free form keywords in Zenodo that, does not help any findability whatsoever. Just highlight that, while also highlighting, the difficult work that would need to be done to make them reusable outputs, so to say. But I completely agree with what you just said. It's, it was exactly a problem.
I think from our work as well, I think there's a couple of things. So we built, alongside our repository, we built researcher profiles, and we tried to build in some fields to describe methodologies and that kind of thing. And the problem was that each discipline had different definitions for even the same word. And so it was very difficult. We literally just built in free text boxes. So I think some of this is around understanding where you need to be specific, where you've got that folksonomy keyword approach, and where you how you describe that in a structured way. So, you know, is it actually just that the structured way is method or practice, rather than trying to get too detailed beyond that, because what it means in this discipline is going to be different to that discipline. The other thing I was going to say, and I don't know if Holly, you're willing to say a little bit about this, is that for me, part of where we're heading here is we've got this policy landscape that divides open access and research data management. So that's one big problem, because they need to be more connected and think about this at research design stage, and actually having not a practice research management plan, but more of a outcomes or outputs or something plan or something at the beginning, and thinking about that at research design stage, because ethics matters, because ownership matters, and actually thinking about that right at the beginning, because as otherwise you end up with that last minute retrospective. But that is, I think, partly because of the policy compliance expectations assume it's an open access output or it's a data set. And that goes back to my bigger soapbox around a culture that's very STEM focused. This culture assumes that you're creating a STEM output. But, Holly, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Oh, just to agree on the importance of documentation. Yeah. But again, it comes back to the skills and the training as well, those soft skills. Yeah, and I think even when we talk about non-traditional research outputs, say if we think about the ref, I think people are still focused on data sets as well.
It's a big deal, though. Even so, I think we often forget how much it is really to get people to look past publications completely, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so data sets is quite a big step, but I agree. We need to get people thinking about different types of digital research objects. I don't know exactly how you'd phrase that, but you know, it's interesting. It's an interesting quandary.
Yeah, and I think so summarizing a bit over this, I think part of that issue is around as Jenny mentioned, that kind of tension between where we kind of trying to put a bit of control over vocabularies and stuff, and where there is still a need to be able to be expressive, but also we're talking, you know, a lot about kind of carpentries and data stewards and that kind of thing, but there's still, if you look through the carpentry and training and so on, and maybe Lisa, again, you could contribute a bit on this, but it's still not across maybe what we would consider the whole expanse of data. We're still seeing that, like, a lot of carpentries and a lot of the kind of like data steward looking more at kind of, you know, how would you collect a data set that's a huge amount of numbers, and how would you do that kind of thing, and the kind of skills thing, which is something that the sister project that we mentioned, Sparkle, looked at a little bit more than we did, was, you know, it's really important to have those kind of processes and skills and awareness in the research chain, so that people, when they come to actually make whatever work they're doing more widely available, that there's the appropriate kind of level of either like researcher knowledge or ability to help and kind of mediate those kind of interactions with the infrastructure. And I think that's something that we really also need to acknowledge, that there's a gap, and acknowledge that it's something that we could do with some focus on around policy, because it's that itself is not just a challenge on kind of like resource and infrastructure. That's kind of a challenge of acknowledging how important this stuff is. I have several high horses. And I think, you know, coming towards like thinking about what are, it's a very grand thing that we put into this part of the session, of what the action plan is like how much of this is about kind of those of us here and the people that we're working with pushing into these spaces and, you know, being on working groups, and how much of it is about more widely kind of canvassing for this kind of general parity, where we talk about like these fair research skills, outputs, objects, and so on, with a real push towards that being the kind of holistic view of research. So the action plan section is in the collaborative notes. If you want to take just 1 or 2 minutes to write down 1 or 2 concrete actions that you think we could take, and then we'll have like a couple of minutes to talk about them, because we're actually coming towards time. So if I just pause for a minute, and if you just think about whether or not there's 1 or 2 like concrete things we could put down in the notes, and then we'll come back together. And if not. Okay, I'll let the frog finish. I love the way that Google does this. We've got a frog, a dinosaur, a goose. There we go, and of course a cormorant.
I think I'm the frog. I was still typing.
Okay. Do you just need another minute, Lisa?
I think I've seen all those little cursor parking lots as well that they put on documents sometimes. Yeah. It's hilarious.
No, I'm done, so it's fine.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you so much for doing it. It really helps. does anyone want to speak to the action points that they put down? I can't imagine who's put down something about fair sharing.
I can't imagine who that would be.
No. Okay. So anyone like to speak? Lisa, want to speak about your actions or anything?
Yeah, no, happy to say, because happy to talk a bit, because what you said before about, I would say that the burden should not be on the researchers to figure out how to make those non-text research outputs fair. I think that at the moment, I think they're against an impossible situation, and I strongly believe anyhow that researchers should not be left alone with their data management, issues, whatever those data are. So I do think that it is, there's need to ensure that the researchers get the support that they need. And at least in Europe, we see that, data steward support is popping up really across the continent. And there's also increasingly data steward training programs or certificate programs or microcredits for data stewards that are popping up everywhere. So there's the certificate program in Vienna, and I just learned yesterday that now University of Helsinki, I think, or no, Finland in general, will be a Finnish national program in collaboration then also with University of Vienna. There are microcredits that are popping up in Ireland for data stewards, and there are other national level training programs. And I think one thing would be to make sure that those training programs include a module or at least reference to non-text research objects. And the Professionalizing Data Stewardship Interest Group, where I'm one of the co-chairs, we are currently in the process of spinning a working group out of the interest group. And the working group will focus on developing data steward personas. And also there, it's now at the back of my head that, we need to make sure that when we consider, the skills and the training of data stewards for the personas, that there also has to be, it has to be inclusive of various types of research objects, so to say.
Fabulous, thank you. Alison, have you anything to add that is not the fantastic thing that you've written about fair sharing?
Yeah, sure. I can. While Lisa was talking, I decided that I shouldn't just talk about fair sharing, and I put something else in the chat. But completely selfishly, but not completely selfishly. Because as I spoke before about how there's probably some gaps in the non-life sciences areas. I mean, who am I kidding? Even with like 4,000 records and fair sharing or something like that, there's no way we'll ever be able to 100% map all of the repositories and standards available in the research data community. It's just not possible. But we do like to try, especially as we're a manually curated resource. So there's really no way with the amount of time that we have available in, I don't know, the history of the universe. But we would like to have some better coverage. So as you're working towards, I noticed you talked a lot about standards and possible implementation of new standards or review of existing standards as relates to this work. If you ever find yourselves editing a spreadsheet, that's probably a sign you could easily, that lists standards is probably a sign you could also make a collection in fair sharing. I don't mean a collection in the sense of a digitized collection. I mean a slice of fair sharing that's personalized for your use. You can include any records you want in it, and then you can link it out and say, this is our list of standards. A couple of RDA groups have already done this. And so it's just a nice way to highlight particular standards and how they're used, and integrating your work within the context of that knowledge graph, that ecosystem of standards and databases I was talking about earlier. So yes, that's selfish, you know, because it'd be nice to have it in fair sharing, but also it would hopefully be a nice thing for you guys. And then the other thing I mentioned was just after, is it Lisa or Lisa? I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
It's Lisa. So there's
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. When you were talking, Lisa, about the professionalizing data stewardship interest group and the working group you're spinning off from it, I'm sure I've mentioned it at some point. I am a member of that interest group, but I'm a member of that interest group in the way I'm a member of about 20 different working groups, and which means I get all the emails, but I can't attend all of the meetings. But it'd be great if we could find a way to use the terminology that a variety of people have worked on, including me. That's about capturing skills, you know, for the purposes of CVs or training material and things around sort of fair skills. So, and that's it. That's my point.
Cool. And I think that's also a really good point around that idea of research environment and open research indicators, and actually reflecting or thinking about that is relevant here too, because actually it's if you're either recognizing in stewardship programs or you're running training that embeds that broad range of disciplines, then you've got a stronger indicator, I guess, than if you're just making assumptions about how things are done already.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Holly, do you have anything to add on?
I think no final comments from me, just to pick up on what Jenny was saying as well about open research indicators as well, is just to emphasize that non-traditional research outputs can really help get recognition for all those people that aren't currently recognized by research as well. I went to an ESRC event this morning about their data policy review report, and that's something that they're really keen on doing. And there was someone there from the MRC there saying that, yes, these non-traditional research outputs are really important for, in the MRC's case, for example, recognizing the contribution of technicians, clinical trial managers. And I think that's something that your work is going to help with as well.
Oh, thanks a lot. Okay, so action, amazing. I will ask, because I want to close more or less on time, if people have the other RDA groups that they think might be relevant to this one, please stick them in. Because I want to close with thinking about whether or not this particular work needs a working group or more potentially an interest group. I'm not entirely sure. And Alison, in answer to your question that you sent me, that I think that's part of what we should be discussing at this virtual meetup next week, is where the kind of like community around this is, and do we need to put in a case statement for potentially a new one that kind of focuses on data and the kind of infrastructure and affordances around it for the non-text, non-traditional outputs, whether that's something that would be useful within the RDA context, and also maybe allow for some of the work that's being done in the individual things like data collections and like fair sharing and things like that, to actually contribute on this particular focus.
I'm putting my RDA Europe hat on now, just to say that if you are considering a working group, then there is support available from RDA Europe side for working groups throughout the working group life cycle. So I'll pop a link to the RDA Tiger project into the chat.
Yeah.
So you can see, just, you know, in case this is the road you want to go down.
Thank you. Alison, do you have a particular thought on WG, IG, or everyone's doing enough and we'll be fine?
Was that me or Lisa, did you say?
No, Alison.
Oh, okay. And you said BG, I'm sorry, I missed it.
So the RDA has like a few things. We've got this birds of a feather now, which is kind of like, is there interest in this at all?
Oh, yeah.
So hey, some of you guys are here. And then it's whether or not it's the kind of thing that should maybe be a working group, and we have a set of things that we produce at the end of it, or an interest group, which is like, you know, nice to talk about, but we don't necessarily have to do anything.
Sorry, yeah, I get. You said BGIT or something. I wasn't sure. Maybe I misheard you.
I thought what I tried to say was WG or IG, but you know.
Oh, WG, IG. That's what you said. Sorry.
There you go.
I'm sorry. It's just my ears, I think.
Oh, I wouldn't worry about it.
It's hard, isn't it? I was listening to what Lisa said and what the others were saying about this. I have I'm a co-chair of 2 working groups, and I am trying to decide if I want to make an interest group now. So that's what the session that I had this morning around the RDA domain ambassadors. So that's Beth and Sarah and Matty and me thinking we do want an interest group, and there does seem to be enough, you know, interest to progress to that. But there's also, what is it? There's something else. It's not an interest group, and it's not a working group, and it's called something else.
It's communities of practice.
Communities of practice. Thank you, Lisa. But I don't know that would also be a good fit for this. Interest groups, what I learned today while we were investigating, because we have a draft charter for this other one that we want to make an interest group, but I wasn't completely sure it would work, because I thought what we're trying to produce as outputs are sort of soft, what might be considered soft outputs. And some of yours you've clearly got concrete outputs, and some are more soft about like the network building and the understanding and the but they were all very clear to me, the people who were at the session, that these kinds of soft outputs are just as valid and should be really encouraged from an interest group point of view. Not necessarily, you know, maybe working group as well, but they did say that interest groups can happily not just produce working groups. You can be an interest group and just produce these kinds of outputs as well. So I don't know if that helps or hinders your decision-making process, but there's a lot more flexibility in the interest groups than I had realized. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was one of because I'm not sure, and again, it may be like coming back on the notes and reviewing this and at the other session as well. I'm not sure whether we've got core things that we could put a charter together for a working group, but I think as an interest group, or I'll have to look up community practice now, which is the joy of discovering stuff about RDA all the time. But as you know, one of those other kind of focuses around that, I think there are definitely kind of like both soft outputs and kind of that network building which would work, and a charter around that would make sense. But yeah.
I guess the big question is, do you want to have something that has a much longer lifespan, or do you want to do something that has a defined end? Because if you want that, you probably want a working group which runs for 18 months and then is finished. And maybe if you wanted to go that route, you might just sort of ask, I know it's not directly relevant, but the changing to collections as data interest group, it's already an existing interest group. They're just redefining the charter. And there's enough of an overlap that perhaps you could join in as a working group on that and maybe have a little bit less overhead. But I don't know what the overhead of an interest group is. But I guess, or if you want to instead have something that's more of a longer term facilitation thing, then you probably want the interest group.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Yeah, the difference really is in terms of, you know, I think the working groups are more specific, output oriented. And I think if the planned outputs, almost all of them veer more towards, as Alison called them, soft outputs or networking, then an interest group might be more appropriate. But I think it would make sense to explore the existing groups overlaps and see also if you know, there's interest there to do something together because on the next steps there are some rather concrete outputs that one could work on as a working group as well.
That's fabulous, thank you. Okay, we're at time and slightly over, and I just want to say thank you so much for all of your valuable contributions. It's been a really great, not necessarily the largest session, but I think it's been just really great.
No, absolutely. And
It's
huge thank
It's
you.
not the numbers that count.
No.
Well, no, I mean, I didn't want to make any statements about quality or anything, but obviously it's there implicitly.
Yes.
Jenny.
And Adam, a huge thank you for facilitating and running and organising this session. But yeah, really nice to meet you, Lisa and Alison. Like I feel like we've ended up in a bit of a vacuum, so it's really nice to reconnect out beyond and talk to people with shared interests.
Yeah, and I hope that next time I'm able to join the video so you would actually see my face. But
Yeah, that's.
I've seen you pop up in quite a few places, Lisa, on Hoover. So I feel like I know you already, even though I haven't seen
okay,
you.
okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna wrap up by saying thanks very much. We'll be in touch with everyone about potential steps. There's obviously, if you just want more, there's the very late night session which we'll be running tomorrow. But the other thing to say is I have set that let's discuss about Arts, Humanities, Shape HSS and all that kind of nonsense thing for like a virtual meetup. And I think maybe some of the kind of like next steps here and some of the bits around the action we could maybe bring to that as well. But I think the idea behind that was I just wanted to try and get a kind of temperature check on the community and how we kind of like think other wider concerns are reflected. So I did work on research data life cycles, and again, it was difficult to get the kind of non-science people to come and contribute to that. So you sometimes feel like, arts and creative practice has a slightly different approach to this, and maybe that would be useful to incorporate in this. So yeah, so thanks very much.
Thank you. Oh, I think Beth said she'll try to come to your repeat session. Beth from the DRI.
Yep.
Great. Amazing.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Okay.